Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second part of our introduction to Shemitah. The year of 5782, is a Shemitah year. It's also a leap year. All this stuff is happening 5782. We've used this Shemitah year as an opportunity to explore our relationship with the environment. We started with some introductory classes about Jewish thinking around environmentalism and our responsibilities to creation. Now we're shifting to actually focus on Shemitah itself. We started last week by looking at the basics of the laws of Shemitah, especially having to do with the interruption in agricultural and economic life. That Shemitah is a complete cessation on agricultural labor. And we kind of like toggled back and forth with the fact that it is a very utopian vision, one that might not totally shake out on a practical sense, but I wanted to encourage us to look at it in its visionary aspect, right? To look at it, what kind of proposal is the Torah making in terms of what Shemitah entails? Like, what kind of society is it envisioning? What kinds of critiques of normal society does Shemitah offer? Just like Shabbat, in a way, is a critique of normal life, Shemitah is also, in its total kind of pulling the handbrake on agricultural and economic life, a critique of what normal life is like. So by holding up this ideal image or mirror image of what else society could look like, Shemitah is teaching us something. And the other aspect I was advocating for is that Shemitah is not just the year itself, but also how it's a kind of pedagogy. The Shemitah is teaching us something in the experience of the year, such that it changes us once normal life resumes in the eighth year. So Shemitah, on one hand, is what is occurring within the year itself, the technicalities of when you're supposed to stop harvesting and what agricultural work entails. And then secondly, it's also the way in which it helps us change our relationship to what normal looks like once the cessation of the normal has occurred. And last but not least, also the way in which during Shemitah involves a certain kind of, let's say, reduction to the common mean. That everyone is on the same plane, everyone's on the same level. There's a wilding of the earth, as I called it, or the way in which we let the earth kind of take its own course. And in that way, there's also a wilding of us. And that's actually what I want to explore in this session tonight, focusing especially on the interhuman aspects of Shemitah. So I want to review a text that we saw, and I want to give it a little bit more time now. So let me just call up the source sheet. Okay. Everyone see that okay? Great. Excellent. There we go. I went too far. Great. Okay, so I want to go back to this. Two kinds of Shemitah. Okay, so we're looking at a Gemara from Gittin. Now, as hopefully we all know by now we've had our classes in Talmud and the like, we know that the Gemara is not like a systematic work. It has lots of different dips and dodges. It's more of an associative work. So the fact that there's a tractate on Gittin, which is about divorce, means that it talks primarily about the laws of divorce, but also it ends up talking about all kinds of things. And we might actually think, oh, what's Shemitah have to do with divorce? Well, nothing literally, but Shemitah in a way is us taking, maybe a conscious separation, conscious uncoupling from the earth, letting each of the us and the earth get our space or something. Maybe we move into a motel. So let's look at the text. It says this: Titania Rebbe Omer. So we quote a Braita, a Tanaitic tradition. It says Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the editor of the Mishnah, says, and this is the matter of Shemitah, Zedvar Shemitah. Shamot, right, which is where we see the word Shemitah comes from. It's the same root, Shin Mem Tet. Bishtei Shmitot, Katuv Midaber. So Shemitah talks about two kinds of Shemitah, two kinds of cancellations, two kinds of abrogations, two kinds of withdrawals, two kinds of letting go, two kinds of release. All right, it talks about two kinds of Shemitah, and they're equal, right? Where one is, the other one is, where the other one is, the other is. Echat Shmitat Karka, ve'echat Shmitat Ksafim. There's the Shemitah of land, right? The release of the land from our control over it, our use of it. And there's the release of money. When you have Shemitah with one, you have Shemitah with the other. When you don't have Shemitah with one, you don't have Shemitah with the other. In other words, they are two, even though our primary association with Shemitah is, let's say, ecologically oriented, still Shemitah is equal parts human and earth, equal parts creation and creature, such that the radical revision of human relationships is just as important in Shemitah as is our cessation from agricultural labor. Okay, so just before we get into the details, let's just do a quick little quiz. Okay, so what is Shmitat Ksafim? When it says the release of money, what does it entail? The translation has an answer, so don't look at the translation.
It's the forgiveness of a loan.
Yes, that's right. So just as in the Shemitah year, we, let's say, again, like maybe again, consciously uncouple from the earth for a year in terms of being an economic partnership. But the result of that, right, then is this kind of radical revisioning of society. Shemitah also is a complete break in another fundamental aspect of economic life, which is credit, right? Credit, i.e. the credit-debtor relationship. So someone loaning somebody capital, someone loaning somebody money. Okay, so all loans have a 7-year, or a Shemitah year cancellation date. So if you loan somebody money in the 6th year of the Shemitah cycle, what might you imagine a loan shark would think, or a creditor would think?
They would want to loan the money because they're going to say, oh, well, in another year, all is forgiven. So
okay, so there might be
I'm not going to lose my money.
Right, because they're worried they might not get it back. Okay, Nisim, what were you going to say?
Exactly the same.
Okay, yeah, and that is the natural kind of induction from this premise, right? That if there is a Shemitah cap on all loans, then that really might throw a monkey wrench in a fundamental aspect of economic life, right? If you are going to try to, let's say, start some kind of business or something, and you don't have the startup capital, you go to a creditor and you borrow money. You get seed capital, right? And you're able to fund your venture, fund your endeavor. Loans is the way the economic system can work. It's a way for people to reach, let's say, manageably beyond their means, right? If we were only able to ever just use what we have, then the economy would not be able to sustain us. It's necessary for people, let's say in a society in which there's inequality, it's necessary for there to be a free flow of capital, right? For loans to be able to be made for people who need the extra money. Okay, but if the economy is founded on inequality, effectively, some people have the money and some people don't. Some people need the money and other people give the money. Shemitah is trying to provide some kind of critical edge to that normalization of inequality. Now, the way it's doing that is by pulling the handbrake on the whole credit system, and that's a pretty radical, radical eruption. Let's keep on going, because the Torah is, as I hope we all agree, is not, is not naive. So let's look at this text from Bahar, from the Sifra on Bahar. So Sifra is the Tanaitic midrash on Leviticus. Okay, so this is on Parshas Bahar. The whole like fracas that's occurred recently with The View. I was like, isn't Joy Behar Jewish? Turns out no, apparently. But I thought she was because of Bahar. But maybe I was thinking of Joy Bechukotai. Who knows? That is a good joke. Thank you for someone laughing. Okay, so Devar Acher, another hot take. So they quote a pasuk in which it says, "V'yichlu avionei amecha." We saw this pasuk above, such that the poor of your land may eat. We saw haru'ui la'adam la'adam, v'haru'ui la'behema la'behema. We saw this last week, right? That which is fit for a human being should go to a person. That which was fit for an animal should go to an animal. In other words, we have an economy reorganized according to need, right? What people need, they get. And it's not that you're hoarding to make sure you can profit, but rather that we have an equal distribution of food such that everything that is distributed is going to who needs it. And here we hit an interesting dilemma, because it says uschirecha toshavecha, your hired hands and your residents. That includes the non-Jews. So a question we have about Shemitah in terms of observing it is the creation is a universal feature. Everyone exists on earth. But Shemitah is a Jewish law. So how does Shemitah impact Jewish and non-Jewish relationships? This is one of the things we're going to explore tonight. And it's a complicated question, but I want us to figure out, by exploring that, I think we're going to try to figure out what it is Shemitah is trying to do. But let's first look at the pasuk, right? It's always very important to look at the pasuk. So this is from Devarim chapter 15. Someone want to read the pasuk, and let's do it in the English, and I'll point out the Hebrew where it's necessary. Someone who's, I'm going to say this because Lauren reads so beautifully so often, someone who's not Lauren, who would care to read. But thank you, Lauren, for your service.
I'll read.
You're welcome.
Great. All right, Alan.
Every 7th year?
Mm-hmm.
Every 7th year you shall practice remission of debts. This shall be the nature of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord. You may dun the foreigner, but you must remit whatever is due you from your kinsman.
Great. We need a translation for the translation, I think.
What does dun mean?
Great question. What do people think done means from context? I have an answer, but let's see if we can figure it out.
Screw over?
Yeah, that is exactly right. That's precisely right. To oppress, effectively. So, okay, so let's just break it down to normal human language. Every 7 years, right, debts are canceled. This is the nature of the canceling. Right? If you have a debt over somebody, if you've loaned somebody money, then you have to let go of the loan in the Shemitah year, and you're not allowed to oppress your fellow or kinsman. Okay? Because it is a Shemitah for God. But you can, it seems, maintain a loan or done in whatever way that means, but it seems like it means you can keep the loan from a foreigner, from a nochri, okay, from a stranger, i.e. somebody in the out group, okay? Now, the nature of this difference, right, that you can't dun your kinsman, but you can dun the foreigner, fascinatingly, Rashi and Rambam agree that it's actually a mitzvah aseh. It's a positive obligation for you to actually in some way maintain a financial relationship in that strong way with a non-Jew. Meaning what? Well, what do we take this to mean?
It's like a flux of income that you can have during the Shemitah year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so can you expand on that? I think you're getting at something important.
Yeah, because this person is gonna continue paying for the loan that have with you during the Shemitah year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's gonna be an income, and that flux of money, it's gonna help the entire community because we're bringing money in.
Okay. So here you're saying here is what, let's say, a stopgap measure. So Rashi and Rambam say it's actually, you have to do it. You have to maintain the loan even in Shemitah when the loan was taken out by a non-Jew. Whereas Ibn Ezra says it's reshus. You can if you want, it's not necessary. But what would motivate Rashi and Rambam to actually say Shemitah is, on one hand, a universal practice, because we saw above in the Sifra that it includes non-Jews, right? That the distributionary aspect of Shemitah includes non-Jews. right? That agricultural labor stops. You're not allowed to employ non-Jewish farm workers to work your land, whereas you obviously can't employ Jewish farm workers to work your land. Imagine a Shemitah system, right, in which it was completely particularist, completely Jew only, right? That like, oh, okay, I can't hire a non-Jew to work my lands, but I can hire a Shemitah goy, and the Shemitah goy can work my farmlands. Right? What kind? I mean, that would have a very strong ripple effect. I mean, it is the same kind of like critique we see of the notion of the. Is everyone familiar with the notion of a Shabbos goy?
Yeah.
Very important book on that phenomenon called Jacob by a historian named Jacob Katz. Funny, there was a funny joke. It says like, oh, it's a good thing that academics aren't named after their books the way like rabbis are, because otherwise Jacob Katz would have been known as the Shabbos goy. But Jacob Katz wrote a book about this like development of this phenomenon, and it is a phenomenon that existed, and it existed because of economic need. Well, let's say lifestyle need, right? That there is, let's say, certain standard of living you need. I think it's especially the case in, let's say, societies in which Jews attained more of a bourgeois status, and they were able to maintain these kinds of relationships to keep things going, to keep the fire stoked on Shabbat. Yeah, exactly. So to keep the fire stoked on Shabbat. But I mean, honestly, like this is the case with lots of synagogues, right? Synagogue got a maintenance person, right? It's got a security guard. It's got, the people who do the catering on Shabbos, for a bar mitzvah or something like that. Now, there's on one hand, you have a critical relationship to it. Oh, I mean, let's play this out. What would your critique of the Shabbos or Shemitah goy phenomenon be? What's your like? Let's say what's your intuitive pushback? Stoke your like social Jewish justice warrior.
Well, if we had Shemitah goys, then we wouldn't really actually be experiencing Shemitah at all.
Okay, so part of it maybe has to do with us, right? That's a way of kind of like cheaping out on the experience.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay.
Isn't the Heter Mechira kind of getting around it that way because you're selling to a non-Jew? Are you going to be going through Heter Mechira?
I'm going to kindly insist we bracket all discussions of the Heter Mechira until we actually tackle it.
Beseder, en baya.
Heter Mechira is a 20th century phenomenon after the resettlement of Palestine by Jews. And the question of, okay, now it's post-Torah times. Are we doing Shemitah or not? What's going on? Or are we going to starve to death? So we'll tackle all of that when we get to it. Some very important discussion. I want to make sure I give it due consideration. But let's just stay in this question. Let's actually let's laser in the Shabbos goy, because I think that's a very good parallel. So just talking about Shabbos goy, right? What's the critique of the Shabbos goy? So one Susie's kind of like stark critique of like basically you're not doing Shabbos, right? It's like, oh, Nishtam, there's the great joke. You go to shul and then someone's like, what's going on? It's like, oh, Nishtam Shabbos Gret, I'm selling my car. And the guy's like, oh, Nishtam Shabbos Gret, how much are you selling it for? He's like, oh, Nishtam Shabbos Gret, I'm selling it for $3,000. And they go, and then they have Kiddush, they go home, they come back at Mincha, the guy's like, oh, Nishtam Shabbos Gret, I'm actually interested in buying your car. And the guy says, oh, Nishtam Shabbos Gret, it's sold. Right, so like, there's a way to use all these like loopholes or whatever to get around actually having Shabbos. Like the guy just sold his car on Shabbos by like, thumb waving it away. So like, yes, by doing Shabbos, you deconstruct the beautiful palace in time that is Shabbat. Okay, Lauren, you're about to say.
It feels like I know it's not, but if you look at it from the point of view of a Gentile, I think it makes the Gentile seem inferior, like, oh, you can use them to do your work, right?
Yeah, that's exactly, that is a great point, right? That there's a potential for exploitation there, right? And maybe in a way, a reinforcing of these ethnic or communal boundaries. That, like, oh, you get to have a day off, but they don't get to have a day off. Right, or your day off is one in which you are like relying on them in this way, or besides the whole like, oh, it's so hot in here, who's gonna turn on the air conditioner? I don't know, like that kind of like weird, rigmarole. All that having been said, I think okay, so that's like those are two very good points. Both the internal point of that it chips away at Shabbos, and the external point that it's potentially exploitative. Right, this day or this year. That is supposed to be equalizing. That's supposed to be a year of social equity, or a utopian Edenic day of peace, not one of market-based exploitative relationships. And yet, we are in some ways using those in the outgroup to make sure that we can maintain a certain level of whatever comfort, or, to have hot pigs in a blanket on Shabbos. But another way of looking at it, I think, and this is important, and this goes along, I think, with what perhaps Nissim's point was implying, is that there's true, let's say, that you are re-entering a potentially exploitative relationship, but on the other hand, in a world in which non-Jews were in insecure positions, constantly exiled, right? Scared of their Gentile neighbors, how potentially radical actually was it, or promising was it, that what it meant to have Shabbos was to need to maintain positive relationships with non-Jews? Right? To be able to avail yourself of a neighbor, to be able to employ somebody in your, adjoining community, to be able to help you out. You're in their hands. You can't stoke the fire. You're vulnerable, and you're inviting them into your home to help you. Now, yes, on one hand, there were literally servants, right, in early modern Germany, fine. But point is that there still is in some way actually intercommunal bonds that are being maintained. So there is, on one hand, let's say this is a demarcation of Shemitah as, on one way, a universal practice, that you're not allowed to completely say this is only Jews, I can employ non-Jewish farmhands, etc. It is for everybody. The land needs to rest, period. But when it comes to strictly human relationships, interhuman relationships, there's a little bit more complexity. And I would even say, and maybe Nancy would appreciate this, she was here tonight, that there's even a little bit of realism, that per Nissim's point, there needs to still be a flow of capital, right? If the economy, especially if the main engine of the economy in the ancient world, because it's an agrarian economy, right? The farm is dormant. How is money working? How is economics working? Hopefully you have enough to, again, distribute and everyone gets what they need. But what if you need capital? So there's a compromise of sorts that Rashi and Rambam say, actually, we need to maintain these economic relationships to make sure that the world keeps on moving. Ibn Ezra says, you can be frum. You can say, actually, you know what, I'm going to be so stark, I'm going to even withdraw from that and forgive even non-Jewish loans during the Shemitah year. Here comes Chizkuni, a medieval commentator, who says basically this point. He says, at a nochri, right? So a nochri yigash, right? That you're allowed to dun the foreigner. Shezoreya v'kotzer botzer she'acholim kor l'shalem oto tigash. Why? Oh, it's not just your world. The foreigner, the non-Jew, right? The nochri, is allowed during. What can the nochri do on Shemitah? They can live their darn life. They have a farm. They have produce coming in. They reap and they harvest. Sorry, they plant and they harvest and they prune. They have food coming in. They're producing. They're trading. They're selling. They're consuming. They are loaning. They are borrowing. Thus, yacholim koro shalem oto. And because of that, then, you're allowed to economically deal with them. You're allowed to make sure that they pay you back. You're allowed to engage in trade with them. Why? Because they are a source. They are one of the sources in which the world's able to turn. So I think what I want us to take away from this part is what seems at first to be, let's say, something that is very Judeo-centric, or something that's very ethnically particular, or even chauvinist, right? Oh, Shemitah seems like it's this beautiful earth year, but really you're allowed still to oppress the foreigner. The point rather is a realistic appraisal of what economic relations entail. One is that they still need to be maintained. Even a year in which you take a year off, they're not. So to suddenly withdraw, think about it this way. If every 7 years you withdrew from the credit and debit system, what would that entail for somebody who didn't get why? This is like the mirror image of the fact that we're gonna like the challenge we're about to see. We said before, Lauren mentioned before, if we knew that if you made a loan in the 6th year, that you won't the guy you're loaning it to only has a year to pay you back, you might be more hesitant to actually loan them the money, which is a problem we're about to address. But think of it this way, but at least they would know why, right? If you were loaning, if Shmuley was loaning Yankel money in the 6th year, and then the guy's like, listen, I'm going to be very strict about making sure you pay me back within 7 months, the guy would at least get why. But if Shmulik was loaning Richard the Lionhearted's nephew, right, like $1,000 or whatever, and he's like, yeah, but listen, you need to pay me back in 6 months, and if not, then I'm going to, well, you'll get to steal my money. I mean, what would that do? Right, what that would do would basically, it would either set the Jewish community up as marks, right, that they can basically, like, that means that there would be no possible economic relations with non-Jews, because either they can take advantage of us, or we're not going to do it. Or maybe we're going to, like, send the goon squad or whatever to, like, break their kneecaps until they give us the money right before Shemitah, right? And that's not a good way to go into Rosh Hashanah. So, like, it would mean that, like, economic relations would be nigh unto impossible because they're not in on it. They're not part of it. I mean, famously, medieval Jews especially were employed as a class as loan sharks, right? So like so maybe that's going into Rashi's point too, right? It's like if a big Jewish business in the medieval period is loaning money, then the Jews would not be able to maintain economic relations at all in the in this time period. Now, apparently, actually, the true story historically is a little more complicated. There's been a couple books written about that recently, about Jews and the credit system. But point being is that the only way to maintain the flow of capital, especially in a year in which we're trying to experiment with something radical, is to make sure that it's being done sensibly. And one of the ways to do that is to either potentially or obligation, or you have the obligation to make sure that you still maintain those credit relationships with non-Jews. Yeah, Lauren.
Okay, so maybe I'm not getting it, but I thought that all these laws only apply to being in Eretz Yisrael. So would it apply to a medieval Jew living in France or Germany?
Shemitah Ksafim still applies. Oh, sorry, that's I mean, well, yeah. So when Gittin says when one applies, the other one doesn't. When one doesn't apply, the other one doesn't. The question is, in a sense, in Eretz Yisrael, we know that like the laws of Shemitah is specific about Eretz Yisrael produce, right? Like produce grown in the land of Israel. But what about loans? So Gittin is saying, maybe loans actually are also strictly about living in Eretz Yisrael. But a lot of halacha is not entirely universal. But the way it ends up shaking out is that Shemitah Ksafim is not just in Eretz Yisrael, right?
Oh, okay.
So it's complicated. It's a lot more complicated nowadays, and we're gonna get into it later. But there's enough of a push to be concerned about that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, besides also, we're going to look at also the phenomenon, the pro spool, like kind of Rebbe Akiva's workaround for this whole thing. But we'll get to it. But point is that what appears at first to be, I think, something that could appear chauvinist or like very particularist about like, oh, it's really, you can like dun the foreigner. I think it ends up being a very sensible and realist understanding of the way in which we need to ensure the flow of capital to maintain economic relationships, especially if the other parties aren't in the same story we're in. Right. On one hand, Shemitah is about the world. It's about the universe. It's about the cosmos. Like everything going into its source, and that's a beautiful point. But on the other hand, that's true if you're tapped into the story. I mean, it's true regardless, but more like it is active if you are tapped into the story. If you're not tapped into the story, right, then like it would be a situation which we'd be potentially exploitable in a way that the Torah wants to make sure we're protected. All right. Any other comments, questions, critiques?
I was just wondering, or I guess maybe more to the point I forget from last week.
Well, you have to do Chazara. You need to watch the video before you go sign into class.
Sorry. Like since they do like state blatantly, like, well, since the non-Jews are still farming and earning money from that, like, were Jews allowed to buy produce, like at the market?
Yeah, so that's what yeah. So part of it is to maintain those loans, and part of it is
So the payback of the loans would be product, not
And again,
necessarily
and
money.
yeah, that's a great point, Susie. It's another way in which, Shemitah or Shabbat, right, is a time of vulnerability in which we are dependent on our non-Jewish neighbors, and thus then it is essential that we maintain some kind of like economic relationships with them. Right, and one's again in which it's not just like us needing them, but also if they need us, then it's more equitable. Okay, so this moves us towards, I think, the kind of the challenge that we started with last week. The push, that maybe Shemitah is too idealistic. Like, oh, it's a beautiful idea, but it can never work, right? Here comes the Shemitah, the Grinch, the Shemitah Grinch. Okay, who wants to? So this is actually picking up right from the verses that we saw before. So Ellen, would you want to pick up the baton once more?
There shall be no needy among you, since the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion.
Okay, so this is continuing right from before that we saw. That's saying you're supposed to forgive the loans, and it'll be okay. Because why? There will be no needy. No one's going to need a loan. All right, so this is the utopian vision, right? Why do people take out loans? Because they need money. And God is saying in Shemitah year, either God is saying the premise is it is a year of efficient distribution, right? Everyone who needs will get, the money, the food for the humans, the food for the animals, et cetera, et cetera. And God's saying, and because now we've reorganized the distribution system to be not about making a profit, but about meeting people's needs, right? We've changed what the metrics of society look like. We've changed the standards of society. It's not about certain people profiting over others. Now it's about the society as a whole trying to make sure that everyone has what they need. Right? So it's very different. The benchmarks are different now. But on the other hand, right, so like maybe it's a realistic point, right? Because what maybe Shemitah is a wholesale economic reorganization of society in which the standard of success is not profit, but rather satisfaction. Right? A very different vision. Or it is a more, let's say, a theological principle that's being said, that in the Shemitah year, God, will ensure that there will be no needy. Okay, and thus the credit debit system is suspended. We don't need it because people will be fine. Okay, let's keep on reading. We're going to skip down to verse 11, although we'll go back. But can you just read verse 11? Actually, no. Continue with verse 7. Continue with verse 7 because it's immediately undermining the point.
If, however, there is a needy person among you.
Wait, but it just said there will be no needy. What the heck is this saying? Okay, this is one of the classic stiras in the Torah. This is one of the classic contradictions in the Torah. God says, literally 3 verses above, there will be no needy. And then in verse 7, God says, but if there's somebody who is needy. That's a null set. There's no needy. How can you have one person who is needy if it is 0? Continue.
One of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware lest you harbor the base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing.
So mean doesn't mean like nya nya nya, like the Shemitah Grinch. Mean in this case means meager, like Scrooge. Sorry for using entirely Christmas metaphors for this, but okay, it's what's the word? What is Scrooge? Scrooge is
stingy,
miserly, stingy. Yes, okay.
He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to him readily, and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land.
Okay. So while verse 4 is describing what seems to be primarily the Shemitah year itself, 7 through 11 is describing what situation? We've already actually gestured towards it, but what situation is 7 through 11 describing?
This is maybe the 5th or the 6th year, just before the Shemitah.
Okay, good. And can you color in the lines? What's the situation?
The situation is that there's a poor person around who really needs your help and who wants a loan, and you won't loan to him because you know that the loan will be canceled in the 7th year.
Cancel
So,
culture.
well, no, is it nullified?
No, sorry, I said cancel culture. I was just kidding.
I didn't hear what. Okay, yeah. So
Okay, and what's
you
the
harden
fear?
your heart.
What's the concern?
The concern is that people will refuse to lend to the needy because they know that when Shemitah year comes around, they won't be able to get their money back. So they won't loan altogether.
Okay, good.
But
So they know that.
conversely, you'll have some people who'll say, I'll wait till that 6th year and I'll really, really beg for some help.
Okay. So let's say, some like chas v'shalom, a tornado sweeps through the city and it tears somebody's house apart and they need to build shelter. They don't have capital on hand, so they go to the local rich, hoity-toity rich guy and say, hey, listen, I need a loan. And the guy's like, okay, here are the terms. And he's, wait a second, what's next year? It's like, oh, it's Shemitah. Never mind, sorry. Good luck living on the street. Right? You can't always control when you are in need. And thus, again, stressing the flow of capital needs to be moving, right? We need to make sure that people have money on hand, even if they don't possess the capital themselves, right? That's why a loan system is essential for any kind of healthy economy. Okay. I mean, how could it, going to school, right? Et cetera. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
No,
what if it only instead of a loan, it just turned as a mazer?
I'm sorry, you what?
Yeah, I have that in mind. I understand that you shouldn't, it's halakha that you shouldn't close your hand and you have to help the people. But
yeah.
Why if just we understand that maybe it's not exactly a loan and we take in account as a mazer?
Right. I mean,
What's the difference?
Ideally, it would be lovely, right? If, somebody gave it as tzedakah, right, to the person just to have the money they need to build a house. But that's a big investment, right? That's you can't rely on that.
Yeah, because the thing that I had in mind is if in Shemitah we are saying and we are making it physical, we are making something physical, that we have emunah and bitachon, and we said, okay, I will have my sustain. And also I remind that everything that I possess is not mine. It's just borrowed by Hashem.
Okay.
So even that money, it's just a redistribution. Even better if it's in our own community, because it's things when we are family. I feel that every Jew, we are all family.
Right.
So why I need to pursue that money back?
Okay, good. I think you are articulating, I think, the exact dilemma, and I want to stay in the dilemma first, but we're going to move towards trying to figure out, in a sense, how can we untie this seemingly untieable knot. The problem is this: come Shemitah year, the loans are canceled. It is a natural human inclination, or whatever, to say, I cannot lend you the money because I don't believe that you'll be able to pay me back, and I can't suffer the risk. And I'm sorry, but you're going to have to find money somewhere else to build your house. God then says, if you are going to be so miserly, then the consequence of that, and what's supposed to, in a sense, be the stopgap measure, or the pushback on you, is that the person who needs the money is going to cry out to God, and you will be guilty. Is that sufficient regulation? Is that a sufficient way to make sure that you are going to get over your, let's even justified economic anxiety, right? Let's say you don't have that much money to loan. You only have a certain amount of money to loan, and you might need it yourself. Is it enough for Torah just to say, beware lest you, in a sense, deserve them giving you the evil eye and that they're going to say, they're going to like cry out to God? Is that enough? That's the problem I want to explore. Yes, I saw Susie first. You're
Yeah, sorry, I took a second to unmute. I don't know if it's still relevant based on where you've just led the conversation, but if you start alone, like, what am I trying to say? So like, if you have a 25-year mortgage, for example, like, does it stop in the 7th year, or you just don't have to pay anything that year and then you start paying again in the 8th year? Like, can you just stretch the loan out past Shemitah instead of not giving it at all?
loans canceled.
Okay. So there's so the longest loan
Yeah,
that could
we are
exist
going
is,
to get to what's called
okay.
the prose bool, the way in which Rabbi Akiva managed to figure out a workable situation. But it's also worth noting, and I think this is to your point, Susie, that the notion of being in debt for, I don't know, your entire life is a pretty recent phenomenon. Well, kind of. I mean, before you had debtors' prisons, right? If you didn't pay your debts, you were thrown in jail. Nowadays, we have those again in America, so that's great. But point is that the notion of, like, let's say a credit debt relationship in which a loan lasted you the entirety of your life effectively, that's a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, or like, in an sorry. Or the way in which, I mean, it's the same way in which the whole credit economy is working, right? Like, all these Fortune 500 companies a lot of them don't have, they're supposed to have capital on hand to be able to pay back any loans that they're taking out, but a lot of them aren't, right? A lot of them are monetizing their debts, right? And they're just like on a razor's edge, which is why, we saw a lot of these, fissures break during the pandemic, right? Is that there needed to be that circulating capital, which is why all these, stimuluses have had to basically be infused into the economy, once every 5 years. That seems sustainable, right? Yeah, Ellen.
Kind of tagging on to what Susie said, but a little bit different. What about, instead of like a large loan that typically would cover, let's say, even a few years, 5 years, why not just give a small partial loan that can be repaid and then start a new loan after the Shemitah?
Yeah,
That way everybody's happy.
that seems like a good
Ish.
solution. Sure, but I mean, what if they just don't pay you? Right? I mean, one of the things I think that's like been really interesting to witness is kind of the relearning of the fact that all credit relationships are risk. Right? Like, I am loaning my money to a corporation when I invest in a stock. Right? That's what all investments are, in a sense, loans, right? And they owe me money back at some point. Now, speculation is a little bit different, and it's worth getting into, actually, like the halachic questions around the stock market. But, right, you always are entailing some kind of risk. If I am loaning money to a corporation, if they go belly up, I might not be number one on the call sheet when it comes to who gets paid back. I, at one point, invested in my friend's, like, like boutique housing thing at one point, right? He called me up. He was looking for like an investor pool. I invested in money. I like went over these terms again and again and again, and I made sure we had terms down in which there was like a guarantee. They had guarantors to make sure if the thing fell through, I would get paid back, and when I would get paid back. But the fact is, if something fell through, or if I wasn't going to pursue it legally, I wasn't going to get my money back. Because the guy could disappear, the business could fall through. Who knows, right? So all credit relationships are risk, and Shemitah is this utopian dream, right, of a year of equity, right, a year in which there isn't this exploitative thing, which means that you can't have these relationships maintained anymore. And yet, on the other hand, would that then, and this is the real moral challenge that the Torah is imagining, would that then end up actually creating a more barbaric society? Right? Oh, the pressure, the expectation of the utopia means I can't even live normal life anymore. It's the reverse of what we were talking about last week. Last week we said the 8th year, I said, in a way, the 8th year is more important than the 7th year. What we learn from Shemitah and take into our real life is part of the work of Shemitah. Fine. But what about the 6th year? Is Shemitah going to ruin the 6th year, ruin the 5th year, make it so that poor people can't get what they need because of this dream of equality? Right? This is like this is an old, like a hoary critique of utopianism, right? Like, you're not taking into account human nature. You're not taking into account, like the contingencies of real life. Like, you want your unicorns, right? And the question now is, and this is the question we're left with, is Shemitah, in a way, just this utopian fantasy, or is the Torah trying to actually legislate it in a way in which it is manageable? Right? Legislate it in a way in which it's something that works. I do believe, we have to have bitachon and emunah, like Nissim was saying, that it's not just a dream. But let's look into the details, okay? So Rashi says, lo ta'ametz, do not be stubborn. Right? Do not let your heart be obstinate. It says, yesh lecha adam shemitzta'er im yiteinim lo yitain. Imagine a person who is struck with pain over whether they're going to loan or not loan. L'chach ne'emar lo ta'ametz, and thus it says, do not be obstinate. Yesh lecha sheposhet es yado v'koftsa, l'chach ne'emar lo tikpotz. And on the other hand, there are people who will just give and give and give without a second thought, but then close it, right? I.e., let's say in the years 1 through 4, they're like, great, fine, no problem, I'll loan out. But then comes year 5, comes year 6, suddenly they're gone, right? So the Torah has 2 verbs, says Rashi, and both of them are trying to address 2 different groups of people. One are the people who are, let's say, really do their due diligence over each loan. And in this case, it's saying you're not allowed to have a different decision-making matrix when it comes to, before Shemitah. And the other people who, let's say, are like, very loose with their capital, very loose with making loans, subprime mortgages and the like. And then they might close up shop, once the 5th year rolls around. And it says, don't close off your hand. Okay, further Rashi says, me achicha avyon, do not withhold from your poor brother, your poor sibling. It says, im lo titain lo, sofcha liot achiv shel elyon. Here comes the consequence. It's not enough for Rashi just to say, if you are somebody who is very deliberate about loaning, do not become, let's say, more exacting or demanding once Shemitah rolls around. And if you're somebody who's actually like loves to loan people money because, let's say, you're a loan shark or something like that, and you want to enter these relationships, you're not allowed to close up shop because, let's think of this again materially, rationally. The first kind of person, let's say, is somebody you go to when you have a good business plan and they might invest in you. The second kind of person is the person you go to when they might break your kneecaps because you need the money, right? Both of those people need to exist in society. There needs to be the people who, let's say, are the more responsible investors, and there needs to be the people, I'm not going to say it's good to have loan sharks, but there need to be people in which there is, let's say, a more accessible flow of capital, let's say in more contingent or emergent circumstances. Okay? Those services need to exist all 6 years. Otherwise, the economic system is going to close up shop. But then what's going to keep people in line? Here comes God's threat. What's God's threat according to Rashi? If you're just to put it in your own words.
You're going to wind up poor yourself.
Yeah, if you don't. And this is something that's really important, right? We think of loaning, I think we think nowadays of credit and debit, or loans as an industry, as being something that's about, let's say, capitalists. Right? Like, I want to start a business or whatever. I need to get my Etsy store off the ground. But what we're talking about here is that people in genuine need, right, need more money than they can get from tzedakah. Or maybe another way of putting it is, Shemitah imagines a world in which everyone gets the food that they need, like the basic sustenance that they need. But what if you have bigger needs than others, right? What if, again, your house blew down? right? What if the only way for you to survive in the coming years, right before Shemitah, is to take out a non-trivial loan? Those sources of capital need to be available to you. God is insisting that capital is available to those who need it. Shemitah is not just about a 7th year utopian imaginary. Shemitah is about a 7-year, i.e. every year, economic critique. Because God is saying, you're not allowed to withhold capital from people. Now, okay, I mean, on a case-by-case basis, maybe you're not going to loan for everybody. But the point here is that God is saying there needs to be accessible sources of capital for people. That is the norm. And the norm can't be abrogated until the norm is abrogated for everybody in Shemitah. Put that in simpler terms, it needs to be the case that people can get what they need every year. Shemitah is a wholesale revolution of society to make sure that everyone can. But all 6 years before Shemitah has to be the case too. And how do you do that? Through loans. Loans, Shemitah karka, Shemitah ksafim. They're the same thing, says Shemitah, says God. Capital needs to be flowing. It's not just what you own, it's what you have available for everybody. That needs to be the way it's working. And here comes the threat. If you close up shop, if you abrogate that social norm, if you withdraw from the social contract, then you're going to be the one banging on people's shutters asking for a handout. What's Rashi's justification of that reading? Well, I mean, besides that it's from the Midrash. What's the Midrash's reason for that? Because it says, Me'achicha ha'evyon, from your brother, the poor, your sibling, i.e. just like you. It's your sibling who is poor, and you might be on the other side of that coin one of these days. Okay. But again, we don't have the goon squad breaking down the doors and making sure that loan sharks are handing out money. I think that, that would go too far. But God, in Rashi, in the Midrash's interpretation, is making, in a sense, not just a theological threat of don't be mean because they're going to pray against you and say that you're being a bad guy, but also a material threat in saying if you break the social contract, if you close up your loan shark store or whatever, if you make sure that people don't have access to capital when they need it, then you're going to be on the other side of that equation. Here comes Rambam in his laws of the Shemitah and of the Jubilee, emphasizing this point. Someone, actually, I'm going to, Nisim, I know you're a big fan of the Rambam. You want to read this in the English?
Sure.
Great.
So the Mishneh Torah in the sabbatical year and the Jubilee 9:30. One who prevents himself from lending to his fellow before the sabbatical year, lest the debt that would be coming to him is delayed and it be released, has transgressed a negative commandment as it is stated in the Varim 59, beware, etc.
Right. Hishamer lecha pen, etc. Right. Make sure that you do not withhold from those in need, from the needy. Okay, wait. So what's just to make sure we get Rambam's intervention here? What is he? He's not just saying it's a bad thing. What's he even saying? It is a
transgression.
It's a sin. That's exactly right. You are violating a lav, right? You are violating a lo ta'aseh commandment. You are violating a negative commandment. Rambam is rereading this. It's not just lest you do that. He's saying thou shalt not withhold from the needy. So so it's not just tis, you're going to be a bad guy. It's not even just going to be God saying you are going to actually end up being in need too. Rambam saying not just, but you're literally sinning. And if you violate a negative commandment, that comes with a real consequence. You have to bring a sacrifice, you have to do this, that, and the other thing, right? So there's real present day consequences. Rambam is saying you are, by violating the social contract, by making sure that by not making sure that there is capital available to those who need it, There's a real present consequence. You are sinning. You are doing an Avera. Great. Weiter, continue.
Okay, so the Varim says, be aware and etc. And it is a big sin. For behold, the Torah prohibit it with 2 commandments.
So it's not just
Beware.
1 commandment, it's 2 commandments even you're breaking. That's a big deal.
Oh,
Yeah.
beware lest, and in every place where it is stated beware or lest,
Right, hishamer, or the word pen, good.
or do not,
Or al, good.
it is certainly a negative commandment.
Aha, so the fact that the pasuk says hishamer and it says pen, right, means beware and the word lest. Each word signifies that it's actually a distinct negative commandment. You are literally violating 2 commandments when you are breaking the social contract by not making sure capital is available.
And the Torah was particular about this commandment and call it unrestrained. And
Yeah, the word blial, right? So we go back, just 1 second. I'll bring us back there. Back to the pasuk, right? Just make sure we have the pasuk in mind. It says, "Hishamer lecha, beware, pen davar im levavcha," right? That you have a matter in your heart, that you like have this terrible thought in your heart. And remember, in Torah, heart means mind. Blial, like blial. So he says unrestrained. That's how we translate it. Blial means like baseless, worthless, terrible, right? Blial, without anything is what it means, right? So blial, though, he doesn't mean just in the sense that it's like a moral qualification of your base thought, but also he's saying blial in the sense that it is an intensification. It is not just 2 commandments that you're violating. It's 2 commandments that God is really insisting on. Because blial means that there's no limit. So yes, technically it's 2, but really you are breaking a fundamental feature of what it means to be a Torah Jew.
And behold, Scripture add to warn and command not to refrain, but rather to give, as it stated in the Varim 15:10.
Mm-hmm.
You must surely give him, and let your heart not hurt when you give him, etc. And the Holy One, blessed be he, promised reward in this world for this commandment, as it is stated. For because of these things will be blessed, he will be blessed, like he blessed you.
Okay, so we have 3 levels of what's going on here. Great reading, Nisim. We have 3 levels of what's going on here. 1 level is that there is a negative commandment. 2 negative commandments you're violating. Right, that's already bad enough. Boo. 2nd level is that it's not just a negative commandment of like that's quantifiable. It's qualifiable because it's blial. It is so intensified in God's insistence, right? It's a real serious violation. It's not just a discrete thing that you're doing bad. You are really breaking something significant. And last but not least, actually, there's a 4th level. 3rd, it is a positive commandment. It says, let's vote. It commands us to make sure that we make sure that capital is available for people. So it's both a negative commandment that you're violating if you keep people from the loans that they need, and you are missing a positive commandment of the fact that you need to be doing this. And then last but not least, it's not just legal. It's also like trans-legal. It's also post-legal. It's also moral. It's theological. It is religious. The point that he says, because this is a really important thing, this is the source of blessing. You need to be a blessing for others. That is the way that I will be a blessing for you. Renee.
My question is, how do you determine if someone is needy? Because to me, there seems to be a big difference lending somebody money to rebuild their house after it burned down, or lending money to someone who, I don't know, has a successful Starbucks franchise and wants to open, 10 more stores and, start expanding. To me, the needy person's the first one.
Would you say that person, the second person, needs another Starbucks franchise?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's the 7th year and the Starbucks guy comes to you and says, I want some, I want a loan. Right. And then you're like, well, you just said you're not supposed to change your
So you need to make sure that capital is available for those who need it.
Right. So how do you determine?
Not for those who want it.
So this is talking about loans for the needy, but not necessarily the economic, like how you make money. And
you are completely within your rights to say, you know what, I'm not going to be a co-signer on a loan so that you can open up your new boutique Starbucks franchise, at like at Bathurst and Steeles or whatever.
Yeah, but then you're already changing your what did you call them before?
The social
your parameters. Like if it was Shemitah, like 1 year after Shemitah, okay, sure, I'll lend you the money because I'm going to make money too over the next 7 years. But in Shemitah year 6, then you're changing your parameters because you're saying, well, you're not a needy person.
In the case of the Avion, I think this is very important, right? It's in the case of the Avion means the poor, right?
So
need, in the sense of like impoverished, right? So like we're talking about somebody who has an emergency need of capital, not somebody who like wants to expand their business.
So then are we talking about this Shemitah, like if you're loaning somebody?
If let's say you had capital lined up to open up a business and you put everything into it, right? And then one of your backers pulled out, then if it's the case that your family's livelihood depends on this, I would say that you are in that case an Evion, yes. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who need a source of capital, not people who would prefer a source of capital.
Is there a Beit Din that gets involved to make that decision?
Yeah, I think these are the, good, weighty questions, the gristly, meaty questions that in a way, you could, I think the precedent Rambam is setting might allow for that, in the sense he's saying, listen, there's 2 negative commandments you're violating and this positive commandment you're missing out on. And you can't legislate somebody missing out on a positive. You're not going to like drag everyone who doesn't put on tefillin into the Beis Din, right? But at least violating a negative commandment, there's a potential case that you'd be making here. I guess the question might be, is it between you and God or between you and people? That's an important question, and we should go into Rambam's Book of Mitzvahs about it. But, on the other hand, or is Rambam using all this like intensely, poetic and flowery language to be basically trying to compensate for the fact that this is still in some ways a moral threat, right? That this isn't like an actionable legal consequence we can really ensure. A lot of this, again, is very theoretical stuff because, like as early as the Mishnah, right, the prose bowl is developed. So like, a way to maintain a loan through the Shemitah gets developed pretty early. But I guess the question really is, again, in the vision of what Shemitah is originally trying to describe, it's able to anticipate a potential problem, and it's trying to compensate for it by either, basically saying you are going to be making a moral failing, right? That's in the pasuk of like, lest they like look at your miserliness and cry out to God for you. That's a real like religious failing of yours. Rashi's saying it's not just that, but it's a potential material consequence in the sense that God's going to, to take it out on you to make sure that you end up needy on the other side of the door. And Rambam's saying actually it's a serious religious violation in the sense that there's 3 mitzvahs that you're missing out, you're violating or missing out on, and that the consequences are potentially quite significant. So I'm trying to in a way like kind of balance between the fact that Shemitah is an ambitious social program, but it's one that anticipates its potential drawbacks, and it's trying to compensate by making sure it doesn't end up reaching too far and the whole thing kind of like snaps and disintegrates. But
is this a rule just for men?
No, I don't see why it would be. We have examples of women who are doing business in the Talmud. Why are you have a lot of people you're stringing along on loans right now?
No. I was just thinking of Eshes Chayil, and it says, she opens her hand. Mm-hmm. Where is it? Where are we? Yeah. To the needy and spreads out her palm to the poor. And what that implies is that there's 2 levels of mental poverty. There's one who's poor for whatever conditions or situations they got caught in. Mm-hmm. And then there's another one who can't even think enough to know that they need, Mm-hmm. And we really need to, like, those are the people we have to reach out to.
Mm-hmm.
But the needy, the poor can come and ask for help still.
Yeah, a lot of those contexts in terms of like Ashes Chayil, or as a famous example actually in the 5th or 6th parak Ksubis about like one of the rabbi's wives who's like a big balas tzedakah, right? It's usually talking about tzedakah, but I think you're quite right to say in a way, and I think this is what the pasuk is making, the difference, and as I think to Renee's point too, the difference between loans and tzedakah is one of degree, not of kind. Right? That loans need to be available because it is another way in which the needy are able to gain access to capital. Right? You can only expect someone to give so much in tzedakah, but a loan is a much higher quantity of money that you can expect from people because the idea is you're going to pay them back. Right? So that higher level of money needs to be available for people because sometimes you have real emergent needs that demand higher costs.
Right, but very often in Jewish law, a husband can override the woman's word.
So
or the father.
Yeah. So
Am I
like,
right?
I think, it's complicated. It's definitely complicated. I think it's a little bit, and I think it might actually draw us away from this a little bit. But there are plenty of examples in the Talmud and Halacha of women operating independently as economic actors. So I don't think it's right to say that this is strictly, let's say, a men's halachic issue. This is a halachic issue writ large. Okay, so let's press on. We get to one of my favorite commentators. I love all the commentators. I'm sorry, other commentators. So this is from the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was a student of the Volozhiner rabbi, the founder of the Volozhiner Yeshiva. A Lithuanian rabbi from the 19th century. And he has a very thoughtful, very conceptual, very thought-through commentary. It's a very beautiful thing. I really recommend checking it out. He says, this is how he approaches the issue, kind of the question of what's happening in the creditor's heart. He says, don't let yourself have these wicked thoughts. He says, Lo yinikar lefanav she'atan noten lo ba'al korcho. So he actually moves it out of the question of the actional question, or the question of whether you're giving or not. He says, you can't let the person asking for money recognize the fact that you are not giving voluntarily. So he's already assuming Rashi and Rambam have done their work, that of course you're giving the money in the 6th year of the Shemitah cycle. So then what's this pasuk saying? That not only do you have to make sure that capital is available for those in need, but also what?
Like give it with good, face?
Yes, that you need to make sure to be protecting somebody's dignity. Think about a person who is in need in the 6th year of Shemitah. Think about how vulnerable that person is. Fine, maybe you're going to give them the loan that they need. But you can give it in such a way as if you're going to really make them really understand just how much they owe you, right? How much over them you are. And isn't then Shemitah being ruined? Isn't Shemitah supposed to bring us into more equality with each other? So the Ha'amek Davar says, no, you're not even allowed in your heart to resent them. You can't let's say you are freaking out about giving out this loan in the 6th year, but you can't let them know that. That's not fair to them. You're not allowed to offload that onto them. Why? He says, because Lev Sameach Metiv Geha. Because a happy heart does so much good. I call it a miracle cure. V'hachi hu lehefech, and the opposite's the case too. A lev ra, a miserly, small heart, does really, brings great pain to someone's presence. Right? You can do real damage in just the emotional dynamics. And that's the thing, is the Ha'amek Davar says, listen, you can never just say, it's just business. Shemitah doesn't let us think that anything is ever just business. Shemitah is making us realize that economic relationships are really human relationships. That we are inherently, fundamentally responsible for each other. And not just materially. It's not just about making sure capital is available, but also you need to make sure to be protecting people's dignity. He says, for in return of this, right? Titain lo batovat ayin, because you need to give them this person with a good eye, i.e. generously. And they're going to give it back to you. Aho! So the idea here is that's developing a network of reciprocity. They're going to give it back to you with a spirit of generosity. V'gam hu yivarechotcha v'zeh poel harbe. And this is like the carrot, it's not just the stick, right? Rambam ended with a carrot too. Ha'amek Davar is saying we need to not forget that we are attached to each other. We have these fundamental relationships. We need to take care of each other. And it's not just about you bestowing as this rich guy money on the poor. That is one over the other. And Shemitah is supposed to be bringing us more inequality. Rather, it's not just them that's vulnerable. You're vulnerable when you give them money in the 6th year. But if you give it to them in a way that shows that you trust them and that you care about them, they're going to pay you back. Do we see that? That they're going to see you as a human being, not just somebody they're squeezing money out of or eking money out of. And they're going to see themselves as a human being because you saw them as a human being. And they're going to own that dignity and perform that dignity and actualize that dignity and pay you back and bless you. I mean, this is an incredible point. I really, just before I get to Renee's question or comment, I want to say, part of the dignity aspect here is that even the poor gets to be a creditor in this relationship, says the Netziv. How? Because they may give you the money, but you give them the blessing. It ennobles the debtor. That's the intervention of Shemitah. Yeah, Renee.
Okay, so you're saying that even though you lend them the money, they pay you back with the bracha? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, no, with money, but they're also going to bless you.
How are they going to pay you back? Because it's the
loan.
debt is, but the loan for Shemitah is non,
Right. So we have two cases. I think ideally they're going to pay you back, before Shemitah happens. Okay. But let's say they don't. What's Ha'amek Davar saying you're going to get instead?
You're going to get the bracha, the blessing, But yeah. I'm also wondering, like, I've had this. Well, I mean, I've had this experience also, and where you lend somebody something and they're so grateful that they want to pay you back, but not with money, so like, are you allowed to accept things?
I'll like grout your bathroom tiles?
Yeah, like if once they get to a position where they actually have something to give, they want to give back to you. And I'm always saying, this is not necessary. Don't buy my kids gifts. They don't need gifts, and like, this is our old nanny. She always buys gifts for my kids. I'm like, they don't need anything, just pass it along to somebody who really needs, like she wants to like pay me back somehow or pay us back. And I'm like, it's not necessary. But then like, I'm wondering in terms of the Shemitah year.
But look at the Netziv's point.
That right? they give you blessing, right? That's all I need.
I think I want to read it a little bit differently.
Okay.
I'm reading it a little bit. I'm pushing the Netziv a little bit. I think what it's showing is that to give somebody or to be an employer or a creditor in a way that inspires reciprocity is the goal of Shemitah. The goal of Shemitah isn't that, I mean, like, in Mashiach, all debts will be abolished forever, but Shemitah is a 1-year break in the normal activity. But the point of it, in a way, is to remind us of the fundamental human relationship that's at the heart of every economic relationship. And it also is let's say it's a more subtle kind of equality, in the sense that it recognizes people need money, and some people have money. And we need to make sure that the people with money are giving to the people who need money. Okay, but then isn't that going to be potentially exploitable, right? We're going to have a whole subclass of people who are just begging, knocking for money. They feel subhuman. They feel less than. They feel terrible. And the answer is no, because the way this is supposed to be done is that you give it with a good heart, and you give in a way that recognizes somebody's dignity, and you make sure that they don't feel pathetic, that they don't feel like gross or whatever, grubbing, asking you, that you are actually entering a relationship with them. And then it's a good one. How? Because they get to be generous too. That's how it's a good relationship. Now, I'm not saying employers should be expecting employees to like give them gifts and stuff like that. That's exploitation. But rather, if employees or debtors or whatever are able to take their own agency back and not see themselves as just takers, right? Like the whole nasty framing from like Milton Friedman of makers and takers. The Torah doesn't believe in makers and takers. The Torah only believes in blessers. And everyone is a bestower. Everyone has the opportunity to bless. Some people can bless by providing capital. Some people bless by providing blessings. And some people bless because they have the opportunity to be able to recapture their dignity by being a giver, not just a borrower. Yeah, Renee.
I think Susie has a question.
Okay.
But I'll go after Susie.
It's getting late, and I do want to try to finish the source sheet. I'm just saying that, but that having been said, your questions are more important than my blathering. So yeah, Susie.
No, I was just sort of, what this is saying is like sort of really, really similar to how we work at the community center that I work at. Like it's really important that people feel like included in the programming and part of the decision making and everything, so that like it's not us like just giving to them or lording over them, or like it's about equality and inclusion, right? So
100%.
Yeah,
I think that's right. That I think the Torah through Shemitah is trying to de-economize the economic system, right? That is saying it is first and foremost a human system. Yes, it happens through money. Yes, it happens through certain kinds of difference of vulnerability. But we cannot forget that everyone here is not just in need. Everyone here has inherent dignity that needs to be protected. Yeah, Renee.
So I guess my question is, like, is the repayment of the loan like only have to do with dollar to dollar, or like if you lend somebody money and it's like the 6th year and the loan's going to be forgiven, but you give it to a needy person and you know that you're probably not going to get your money back, but then like I don't know, 2 truckloads of apples show up on your driveway, like are you allowed to accept that? Because it's almost like they're repaying you somehow even though they're not supposed to. Is that like transgressing the Shemitah year?
It's like a Sopranos situation. Like
I don't know. I'm just saying, like, okay, I'm giving you a loan, but then it's Shemitah year, and like all of a sudden they're giving you,
right.
things back to pay you back. But like,
I think in some ways this is intuitive, right? Like intuitive, like if somebody, let's say, welches on what they owed you, right? They owed you money and before Shemitah, and they didn't pay you back, and then they give you a gift later because they feel bad and they want to give it back to you. That's lovely, and you can accept the gift, but they don't owe it to you, and that's really important. Whereas if you like put them in a situation which they feel like they do owe you, even though the debt has been canceled, then that's wrong.
Okay, good. Yeah.
In other words, people don't get to choose how they pay it back. They've got to pay back exactly what they borrowed.
Well, I mean, ideally, yeah.
You lend money, they've got to pay back money.
To be very clear, if Shemitah happens before you pay the loan back, you don't owe them money anymore. I mean, again,
right,
bracketing pros bowl, like in the ideal Shemitah situation, if you borrowed money, let's say like at 11:59, right before Rosh Hashanah, 6th year of the Shemitah cycle, a minute later you don't owe people money anymore.
Wow.
Okay, but again, let's say you borrowed money from somebody somewhere in the 6th year. You drew up terms. You were supposed to pay them back before Shemitah happens, and you didn't. Let's say for a totally understandable reason. Something terrible happened, and you just didn't have the money, right? Like you just didn't have, it's not like you were being negligent, you just didn't have it. That's unfortunate, but that's all, again, all loans are risk, and all loans are, again, and that's what I'm trying to say, Shemitah helps us remember how vulnerable we are. That economic relations recognize in some way human vulnerability. And the key to Shemitah is remembering that we're not just profit monsters, that we're human beings. And that economics can be a way actually to ennoble people and to recognize and to protect each other's dignity, not a way of taking advantage of each other's vulnerability. And that's the critique that Shemitah is making. And so I think the Netziv is saying two things in his second comment. One is, by giving somebody a loan in a way that recognizes their dignity with a good smiling heart, that will actually, I think, lead them to be in a situation in which they will try their best to pay you back as much as they can. But even if they don't, like, because they just couldn't, Netziv is also trying to create, like, let's say, like a theological, like spiritual credit of sorts, in which they will be like, their heart will be paying you back because they will be blessing you. And what it means is that he's trying to say, yeah, again, a loan is not that different from tzedakah. The point is that you're giving people what they need. The point is, secondarily, you're getting back what you gave. So again, ideally, the person will pay you back. Of course, they owe you money. But if they don't, the Netziv is trying to, in a way, to like soften that blow by saying, like, there's something more important that Shemitah is trying to help us remember: our souls, right? That often we check our souls at the door when we enter the loan office, when we enter the bank. And Shemitah is trying to help us remember that we never stop being spiritual creatures, even when we are dealing with things.
Are we allowed to pay back during Shemitah year? Like, not to request it, but to opt to volunteer to pay back some or in
Yeah,
full?
you're always allowed to give a gift. But again, but no one can force you to give it back because you don't owe them anything.
So say you lend me $10,000, and with the condition that it's paid before Shemitah, whatever our conditions were, okay, and something goes wrong for me and I get it 2 weeks into Shemitah.
Okay. That's on
so
me.
It's on me, but I can still pay you back.
Yeah, if you want to. I think that's his point, right? Is that the person will regard you with a good eye. I think he's like saying, on one hand, like, if you recognize people's dignity, they might be likely to pay you back even if they don't need to. I think, again, what we're getting to here is not the question of obligation. When Shemitah happens, all relations of obligation are abrogated. They are gone. They are done. But the Netziv is trying to return us in a way to remember that we're both human beings. That, by recognizing someone's dignity, they might end up actually going above and beyond for you. Or let's say they can't, or they don't, or whatever. Then there's still another level in which you never get paid back, but by recognizing someone's vulnerability and by protecting their dignity, you are getting something back also, which is bracha, right? You're getting back a sense of what it means to be engaged in this process of blessing, right? Like, it's the positive side of what we saw in the Midrash. The Midrash says, if you withhold from people who need, you will be poor. And the Netziv is saying, if you give to people in need without primarily concerning yourself with whether you get paid back or not, you will be rich, right? You will be spiritually rich. Now, again, is that enough to compensate? Is that enough to make sure people will be living up to their obligations even when it's hard? I don't know. But we're looking at like this edifice that's being constructed. Rashi, right, saying that there's the potential consequence of having it swing around on you. Rambam having the religious consequence of it being a mitzvah and how important this is. And Netziv saying that the humanistic point he's making, right, that there's something fundamentally interhuman about human dignity that's being recognized and practiced even in economic relationships. That the Shemitah is a resistance and a refusal to believe that when we're dealing with material goods and with economics, that we're not still dealing with our souls. It's still spiritual work. Okay, so let's look at the. Let's move on to this last midrash from the Sifra, which is, I believe, is our last text, and then we'll close here. So the midrash says this. It says lachem, v'lo la'acherim, for you, not for others. To eat, lo'achla, and not to bring, and v'lo lahavim imena menachot, and not to bring sacrifices, basically. V'lo lahavim nesachim imena, not to bring libation, like drink, wine offerings either. L'chal lavdecha lamatecha, right? We saw this above, right? For you, your servants, your maidservants. Matalmud lamar. What is the Torah saying? By including, right? It's saying it's not about planning for the future. It's not about bringing offerings. It's about consumption. It's about bringing us back to remembering what we need, right? Going back to what we were talking about last week. Shemitah brings us back to recognize what we need. It says, what is the Torah saying? Because it says, it says, the 7th year you will let the land rest and will lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat. Shiachol ainli peirot shevi'it nechalim ela la'aniyim bilvad. I might have thought that the fruit of the Shemitah year might only be eaten by the poor. Minayin afl ashirim. How do I know that the rich get to eat too? Now, that's interesting, isn't it? You might have thought that the Shemitah year, in a way, is a year of tzedakah. It's a year in which we cease all economic activity, and it's like this, it's this beautiful thing in which we make sure that we means test Shemitah. It's only for the poor. If you can prove that you're poor, great, you get to eat. But no, the Midrash says it's not just for the poor. Shemitah is for everybody, because the point of Shemitah is to be teaching not just the people who need, that they deserve to get what they need, right? Shemitah is teaching us, that the poor deserve to have access to what they need, right? Whether it's loans or food, right? That you have a right to access to capital and you have a right to access to food. But it's also teaching the rich, those with means, that they also are still in touch with their needs. That it's not just that they're being, charitable and generous and giving. They are part of this too. They take a hit this year, and thus they get to benefit. And there's something I think really powerful about the fact that Shemitah is a universal program in this way, in which it's not just like a charitable program in which it's designed for the poor to get something, but everyone, even the rich, are equally invested, or at least are also invested in what it means for their Shemitah to function. So how do we know that even the rich get to eat? Talmud Lamar, lecha lavdecha lamatecha. Lecha, you too. Not just the servants and maidservants, but also you, the employer. Pardon me. Hare ba'alim ashirim amurim. It refers to employers, ba'alim, owners, capitalists even, rich people. That's what it's talking about. Avadi mishfachot amurim. And it's talking about employees, servants, maidservants, etc. In kain lamane amar v'ichlu avionei amecha. Why does it say v'achlu avionei amecha, that the poor of your people will eat? Ha'aniyim ochlim achar habeyor v'lo ashirim. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that the poor are allowed to eat after the biur. This is a technical feature of Shemitah. That's when you remove from the storehouse the fruits of the Shemitah period. Okay, so the poor are supposed to eat first. Okay, the poor eat first, not the rich, says Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yossi says, Achad aniyim ve'achad ashirim ochlim achar habeyor. They both eat after, basically at the initiation of Shemitah. What I'm taking from this, and the point I'm gleaning, from this, is that there is a program of social equity in Shemitah. It is not a means-tested program of bestowing charity on the needy, but rather it actually, in a way, reduces everyone, at least in Rabbi Yossi's model. Even Rabbi Yehuda says that both the rich and the poor get to eat. In a way, actually, the poor have like privilege in Shemitah in this kind of way. And they get to eat first. But Rabbi Yossi, in a way, is like even more radical by insisting it's a universal program. Everyone is on the same playing field when it comes to Shemitah. Everyone is brought back. It's a program of degrowth, right? It's a program in which everyone is brought back to the bare essentials, and everyone is remembering what it is that they really need. Back to Renee's point about the question of loans, who's needy, who's not. Shemitah is a program that helps us remember the difference between needs and wants. Shemitah is about helping us relearn how to reconstruct a society based on making sure that everyone gets what they need. And then after that, people can get what they want. I think that's something key that we're missing in a lot of our talks about Shemitah, which tend to just make it something spiritual. What I've tried to show in these classes is I've tried to bring out the spiritual elements that we talked about above, about Rambam's point about, about the charitable nature of, it's a basic principle and you're doing something bad, boo, boo. And Ahmed Dover saying that the poor is going to bless you too, that these are all lovely ideas, but part of it is always, always, always about making sure that we have a society in which everyone who needs gets what they need. And only after they get what they need can people get what they want. Shemitah is a pedagogical program in which it's trying to reprogram us about how to function economically, not to check our souls at the door when we enter the storehouse, right? Not to check our neshama at the door when we enter the bank, but rather all of our economic activity is first and foremost interhuman activity, and thus we can never forget what we owe to each other. It is not an accident that right before the Shemitah verses, this is what the Torah says. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. 6 years you sow your land and gather in its yield, da-da-da-da-da. Those seemingly are irrelevant. You don't oppress the stranger. Also, there's Shemitah. But Shemitah is designed to help us remember the fundamental contingency of what it means to be alive and how that was taught to us through Jewish history and our experiences in Egypt. That we never stop being vulnerable. We never stop living that contingent, precarious life. And all of economic security, all of the loans that we make might teach us, oh, you know what? I'm not a taker, I'm a maker, baby. I give people money. I'm fine. And the point that Shemitah is trying to teach us is that too is a relationship of vulnerability. That too brings you into contact with those who need. And Shemitah helps us relearn how to remember what it is to be in that precarious state. Rashi says, and what is left the animals will eat, right? Shemitah, you don't farm, but whatever's left over, that's what the animals eat. Rashi says, this connects the food of the poor with the food of the animals. Not in a way that animalizes the poor, but rather that shows that we are all on this basic level. Just as animals eat without needing to tithe, aho, so do the poor eat without tithing. And thus we see that there's no miser during Shemitah. Aho. So it's not that Shemitah is a time for the poor. Rather, everyone's poor during Shemitah. Shemitah is, I said this actually in shul this past Shabbos. I said, Judaism isn't like you don't take a vow of poverty when you become a rabbi. It's often quite the opposite. Although not for everyone. but here actually we do have a program of poverty. Shemitah is a year of degrowth. Shemitah is a year in which you are not a businessman. You are an animal. Everyone's an animal. We're all brought back in touch with our basic needs. But interestingly, and Rashi brings that point very subtly around the back end, because Rashi says, how do we know this? Because there's no miser during Shemitah. If the poor and animals don't give miser, like food that you feed to animals, you don't need to tithe from. And the food that in tzedakah, you don't need to tithe from that. And the fact then that there's no tithing during Shemitah means that we're all on the same level. We're all on that same basic level. Because if there's no tithing when you give to those who need, and you are then the food that you eat doesn't need a tithe either, it means that you're on that level too. And we'll close with this really incredible text from the Kli Yakar, who was a 17th century commentator and essayist and preacher named Ephraim Lunshitz. He says this. The seventh year causes assembly and... Oh, sorry. This is in his commentary on what's called on the mitzvah of the Hakel. Hakel is during Sukkot, the king would gather the whole nation and would read from the Torah, and basically it would be the way in which the king is supposed to be the teacher-in-chief, the educator-in-chief, which is a much more beautiful notion of the executive, I think, than a lot of contemporary societies. But the Hakel uses a lot of similar language as the Shemitah, and the Kli Yakar is trying to explore this. So he says, that the Shnata Shemitah Gorem Gam Ke Mahahakel, right? And the Shemitah causes some kind of ingathering, right? For this gathering of the people, for some kind of education. V'hashalom, and a sense of social harmony. Al yedei shelo yizra v'lo yatzmiach bo, because we're not engaging in agrarian labor, right? We're not planting and we're not harvesting, etc. V'achlu avyonei amo, and the poor of our nation are guaranteed the food that they need. Ki eino rashai l'hachzik b'tfuat shanat hasheva kib'al habayit. Because the landowner is not permitted to hold on to the produce, right, the food of the 7th year, like you would when you're trying to be an owner, i.e. an employer. You're not allowed to engage in profits. What's this like? It's like manna. You're not allowed to hold on to extra food. You're not allowed to hold on to stockpile. You're not allowed to try to gain advantage over anyone else. Like we said above, Shemitah is a year of complete distribution. Everyone has to get what they need. That's your number one task. V'zeh bli safek sibat hashalom. And this undoubtedly is the reason for the social harmony. Shemitah is a year of peace and harmony and equality. Ki chol divrei ribot nimshachim mimidat shali shali ze omer kula shali v'chol ze eino kach. He says all of this social strife, all these rebos, right, all these like claims you make against each other, the contests, the arguments, the disagreements, it all comes from arguments over who deserves and who owns what. Someone says that's mine, and someone says no, that's mine. Someone says, oh, that's all mine. Someone says, that's all mine. Someone says, part of that's mine. The other person says, no, all of it's mine. Right? We see all this in halacha, right? Arguing over who has a claim to this, who has a claim to that. But no, that's not allowed on the 7th year. Eino kain kol kach b'shana shevi'it, ki bekum v'aseh. Rather, it is a positive commandment that ein hakol shavim, aval b'sheh ve'al ta'aseh hakol shavim. So it's a very interesting point. It's a very subtle point, but with this we'll close. He says, in the kum v'aseh, not everyone's equal, right? Some people, when Shemitah rolls around, not everyone's equal yet. It's not Mashiach time. Some people are rich, some people are poor, even on Shemitah. And Shemitah is trying to teach us what it means to gain access and to try to teach us how to prioritize a society that distributes more efficiently, that makes sure everyone gets what they need, yes. But the fact is, some person's got like $3 million in their bank account, someone else has $2 in their bank account. This is true. So some people are able to gain access, have access to more resources than other people, fine. But when it comes to the velo ta'aseh, everyone is equal. When it comes to what you're not allowed to do, everyone's the same. Because you're not allowed to engage in agrarian labor. You're not allowed to be, extracting your debts from people. It levels people out. And not just that, I would say it also removes us from these exploitative relationships. And that's the source of social harmony, says the Kli Yakar. So, as we wrap up, I want to make sure we see what the Kli Yakar is saying, because I think actually it's a really great place to end. Shemitah is not just about the technical rule of ceasing agricultural labor at a certain time. It's not even just the technical rule of the fact that the loans peter out at that time, but it is a radical social program that has a certain social end, and that end is harmony, equality, and peace. Shemitah cannot work if it means that we have a more stressed out or anxious society, one in which people are trying to work around it or get all these loopholes and the like, or even if like the pasuk anticipated, even if Shemitah would make us less inclined to help each other out. Shemitah works because it is trying to insist on showing us what the fundamental essence of what it means to be alive is, to regain connection and access to what it is that we need. Shemitah is helping us remember what it is to have needs, not just have wants, to have bare necessities, not just aspirations. And not why? Because think about what happens in the 8th year. If someone comes around to you and says, I need this loan, and you have had a year in which you've had to deny yourself opportunity after opportunity, then you are going to, I hope, and I think the Torah hopes this too, be more inclined to help somebody else achieve. Because you know what it's like to not be able to, because of context and circumstance. In a way, Shemitah is a material program of moral sentiments. It is trying to strip away our advantages over each other, remove us from exploitative relationships, help us regain fundamental basic connections with each other, and help us remember how it is that we are fundamentally interconnected, that we need each other, and that Shemitah is trying to teach us ultimately what it is we need, and then one of the first things we realize that we need is each other. So I hope that we're able to, in our individual ways, learn that, and especially as we continue learning more about Shemitah as the year progresses. Thank you so much for joining for a class in which we really did, these 2 sessions really covered a lot, but I hope we've gained a taste of what else Shemitah has to offer us. I'm going to drop the source sheet in the chat if you want to learn it along at home. And let's see what else is going on. Thursday, Parsha Chat. We're going to be talking about Parshat Tzitzaveh. Shabbos, as always, Shabbos. So please sign up to come to shul. It'll be great to see you. Saturday night, we're having a Havdalah in front of the shul at 7 p.m. and then we're walking to Eglinton Park and going skating. So I hope you can join us. We'll be celebrating Purim Katan, so if you are inclined to enjoy a nip of a little bit of schnapps, you are more than welcome to bring some boozed up hot cocoa. And then we'll be having a special class next Monday. We'll take a quick break from Shemitah because we went so hardcore. We'll be learning about Purim Katan, one of my favorite major minor holidays, and pressing on as always. All right, thank you so much, everybody, and have a great week. Shavua Tov.